All right, welcome. So, have you ever stared at a messy NMR spectrum and just felt that sense of defeat? Yeah, you're not alone. But today, we're going to fix that. I'm going to walk you through how to turn those totally confusing results into clear, beautiful spectra that you'll actually be excited to analyze and, show off. Okay, let's just get right to it. On the left here, yeah, that's the problem, right? A bad spectrum. We're talking low signal to noise, maybe some missing peaks, just a mess. But on the right, that's our goal. See those tall, sharp peaks, the super high signal to noise, that perfectly flat baseline? That's what we're aiming for. All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start by defining that perfect spectrum. Then we'll get into prepping dilute samples, calibrating your pulse width, tackling the key acquisition parameters, and finally choosing your carbon experiment. Let's dive in. Okay, section 1, the perfect NMR spectrum. So what are we even talking about here? What's our definition of success? This quote just nails it. It really is a great feeling in the lab to see a beautiful NMR spectrum that gives you all the information you want. But let's be honest, getting there can be a real pain, especially when you're working with dilute samples, which is a super common challenge in low-field NMR. So let's tackle that problem head-on. So let's talk about prepping those dilute samples. How do you fight back when you just don't have a lot of material to work with? Well, you get smart with your prep. It all starts before you even get to the spectrometer. Okay, here are 3 absolutely crucial tips. First step, optimize that solvent volume. Seriously, you only need about 400 to 500 microliters to cover the RF coil and get the job done. If you use any more than that, you're literally just diluting your precious sample for no reason. Now, this next one is a real game changer, susceptibility plugs. Okay, so what are these? They're these special little inserts for your NMR tubes that basically force your small sample volume to stay right inside the active part of the RF coil. This means every last bit of your material is getting measured, which can just dramatically boost your signal to noise, especially when you're sample limited. All right, so our sample is prepped and ready to go. Next up, let's talk about calibrating your pulse width. This is a super important parameter that can totally make or break your spectrum. It's all about mastering that flip angle to get the absolute maximum signal. So what exactly is the pulse width? Well, you can think of it as the push we give the nuclei with the RF pulse. It's measured in degrees, and people also call it the flip angle. The whole goal here is to get a perfect 90-degree push, because that's what produces the maximum possible signal we can measure. It's kind of like hitting a baseball right on the sweet spot of the bat. You get the most power out of it. And this table just lays it all out, right? Look at this. A 30-degree pulse, you're only getting 50% of the potential signal. A 60-degree pulse gets you up to about 87%. But at 90 degrees, boom, 100%. You get all of it. That's the sweet spot we're always aiming for. So the big question is, how do you find that perfect 90-degree pulse? Well, here's a really clever trick called the 360-degree method. Instead of trying to find the maximum signal, you actually find the 360-degree pulse first. Why? Because at 360 degrees, the signal completely disappears. It creates a null. And it's way, way easier to pinpoint that sharp dip to 0 than it is to find the top of a broad peak. Once you find that 360 value, you just divide it by 4, and bam, you've got your precise 90-degree pulse. But wait, here's a little twist. Sometimes less is actually more. Check this out. For certain carbons, like carbonyls that don't have any protons attached, a full 90-degree pulse is actually too much. On the left, you can see that with a 90-degree pulse, that carbonyl peak around 165 ppm is almost invisible. But look on the right. When you use a shorter pulse, like 30 or 60 degrees, that same peak is greatly enhanced. It just pops right out. Okay, let's move on to our next section, key acquisition parameters. We're going to look at the relationship between time, data, and resolution. So there are 3 really important ones you got to know. There's SI, which is your data size, the number of points you're collecting. Then SW, the spectral width, which is the range of frequencies you're looking at. And finally, AQ, the acquisition time, how long you're actually listening for the signal. And here's the key thing to remember. These 3 are totally interconnected. You can't change one without affecting the others. And it all comes down to this first formula. Your acquisition time, AQ, is just your data size, SI, divided by 2 times your spectral width, SW. Now, what does that really mean? It's basically how long the instrument is listening for that signal after it sends a pulse. And generally, a longer listening time means you're going to get a better signal. So why does that matter so much? Well, it's because of this next part. Your resolution is simply 1 over your acquisition time. So a longer acquisition time, a longer AQ, gives you better resolution. And that means you can see those little details, like peaks that are super close together. It's always a bit of a trade-off, right, between time and detail, but for that extra clarity, it's often totally worth it. All right, our final section. Let's talk about choosing your carbon experiment. When it comes to figuring out your structure, you've got two really powerful tools, DEPT and APT. The big question is, which one should you use? Let's break down the pros and cons. Okay, so here's the essential trade-off. DEP is fantastic because it lets you tell the difference between CH and CH3 carbons, which is super useful. But, and this is a big but, it has a fatal flaw. Quaternary carbons are completely invisible. They just don't show up. Now, APT, on the other hand, shows you every single carbon, including those quaternaries. The downside? It can't distinguish between a CH and a CH3. So if seeing every last carbon is your top priority, APT is probably the way to go. Let's see how this plays out in practice. In both experiments, your CH and CH3 groups point up and your CH2 groups point down. That's consistent. But look at that bottom line. That's the whole story right there. The quaternary carbon is just invisible in the DEPT experiment. But in the APT spectrum, there it is, pointing down, clear as day. That is the crucial difference you need to remember. So there you have it, a bunch of practical tips to help you get the absolute best data from your spectrometer. And, that brings me to a final thought to leave you with. We've talked about what we can do today, but what about tomorrow? As these technologies get more and more sensitive, more accessible, what new questions could we answer? What becomes possible if we could instantly analyze any molecule, no matter how complex or how dilute it is? It's pretty exciting to think about.